and that he can see and hear you. Mr. Cruz, would you raise your hand, please?
I see him.
You see him?
Yeah.
Okay, and Mr.
Yes.
Cruz, can you see Dr. Connor?
Yes, ma'am.
And Mr. Cruz, can you hear Dr. Connor?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Mr. Cruz, at any time, if you cannot see or hear him, please let your lawyer know and they'll let me know. The same thing with Dr. Connor, okay? Also, Dr. Connor, I'm not sure how often you've testified, but when there's an objection, if you would please just stop talking until I can rule on it. If sometimes during Zoom, the witness doesn't hear that somebody says objection, so what I will do is I'll say, sir, give me a minute or something to that effect. Wait just a second, please. And at that time, if you would just please stop talking until I can rule, and then that's it.
Sounds good.
I'm just going over things that have been issues with other witnesses on Zoom in this trial. That's the only reason.
Judge, may I just bring up one last thing?
Okay.
As a consequence of your ruling on 17, 19, and 20, I think it was,
Okay.
there is one of those same graphs appears on page 47, which previously, Your Honor, had ruled was admissible. And I just don't want to run afoul of what Your Honor just ruled.
Is this the type of graph that we were under the impression that your witness had compiled either in the past or in the present time for
Right,
this case, for his testimony?
He participated in the research that was compiled for the data represented in the graph, but he did not make the blue graph on page 47. He did make the graph next to it, which represents Nick's scoring. Does that make sense?
Yes. So the graph to the right. To the right of the blue rectangle on slide 47 was made by your witness in preparation for his testimony, and he has the blue graph just to be able to compare what he made to the actual study.
That's correct.
State?
Judge, I don't have a problem with the graph on the right staying, but as far as the graph on the left, that should be removed.
Okay, for demonstrative purposes, in order for the jury to get anything out of this, if they can't see the I don't know what you would call it, the standard graph, I don't know how they would make heads or tails out of the graph that was compiled by the witness. So what I'm going to say is this, Mr. Secor, do not make the blue rectangle a feature. In other words, it's there for the jury to be able to understand the graph that was made for Mr. Cruz for this trial.
Yes, ma'am.
If that makes sense. Okay, so the state's objection is overruled. Yeah, that's it. Okay, sir, I'm not going to swear you in until the jury comes in. That's why I haven't done that yet. Yes, Dr. Connor? Did you hear me say?
Yes.
I think you're on mute. Okay. When the jury comes in, I'm going to swear you in and ask you to state your name as if we've just met for the first time, okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Now, may I approach the podium?
Yes.
Judge, is it okay that after lunch we bring you the copy without the redactions, just so we can make it part of the full file for appeal?
Absolutely.
Your Honor, is there anything?
Hold on 1 second, please. 1 second. Yes?
Your Honor, consistent with this court's ruling regarding the hearsay statement, the double hearsay statement that Dr. Connor relied upon, in making his slides on slides 25 and 26, I would like the court to do whatever instruction it seems fit to let the witness know not to refer to the report of the conversation that the witness, that the deceased declarant had with Dr. Heather Holmes, please.
Okay. Dr. Connor, Can you hear me, sir?
I can.
Have you explained this to him, Mr. Secor?
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Connor, can you hear me?
I can.
The state and the judge want to make sure, man, my voice sounds awfully loud up here, that you are not going to make any reference to the actual words said by Brenda Woodard to Dr. Heather Holmes. You understand that, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
In other words, sir, if the information regarding the biological mother using crack cocaine and alcohol during her pregnancy was a fact that was made known to you, and you used that fact as a basis for your opinion, that's fine. You can testify to that. However, any of the details about the quotations, I kept drinking to calm my nerves, it was stressful, those things you cannot testify to, okay?
So, sorry. So I can testify to the fact that I am aware that she was interviewed by Dr. Holmes and that Dr. Holmes, and that she acknowledged using alcohol and cocaine during pregnancy, correct?
Actually, no. I'm glad I brought it up because it is a little confusing. So, forget that interview. Her friend has already told the court and the jury that she knew the biological mother, and she knew the biological mother when she was pregnant, and that she used crack cocaine and alcohol during pregnancy. And those were facts that have been testified to that are before the jury in evidence. So those are the only facts that you can testify to, that you're aware that the biological mother used crack cocaine and alcohol during pregnancy. But as far as her interview and as far as anything other than the fact that she used crack cocaine and alcohol during pregnancy, which really, the fact that she may have used them while sleeping in a car and all, those are the things, I assume those don't affect your opinion.
What about the information of her use while she was in the records?
Excuse me?
There was information about her use of alcohol in her records. Are those free for me to discuss?
I'm not sure what he's
Yeah,
talking
there are birth records where she acknowledges abusing alcohol while she was pregnant, and that's part of his presentation.
and those are in evidence.
Yes, ma'am. And there's a slide in his slide deck that points that out, and there he's reviewed those records.
But have those been testified to? I'm sorry, I don't remember.
I can't remember.
Yeah. Testified to the Dr. Scully, the adoption records and birth records.
Dr. Scully has testified to the adoption records and the birth records. Scully Danziger, is that right?
I apologize, I just don't remember.
She was a pharmacologist, if that helps.
And so his adoption records were put in through her, and there's a note in the adoption records that the mother admits to using alcohol and drugs during pregnancy?
Adoption records and the birth records actually at the hospital.
And those are in evidence.
I believe so.
Come on, guys, I need to be able to give this witness a clear picture of what he's able to testify to. I don't know.
Well, I can tell you that he has reviewed them, and they certainly will be in evidence, which is consistent with the case that we were discussing earlier, that an expert may testify to information that either is in evidence or will be in evidence.
State, are you agreeing to that? I don't remember.
If they come into evidence, Your Honor, but, they have to come into evidence in order for the witness to testify about it. And just to be crystal clear, so that this witness understands, the witness cannot testify as to the interview that Dr. Heather Holmes conducted of Brenda Woodard, and cannot testify as to anything he learned or opinion he reached from that interview. Because it's double hearsay.
I think he understands that. As far as records, birth records and adoption records, there was a lot of hearsay and witnesses testifying to certain things. and I just don't remember. So can we please make absolutely sure that what he's being a diligent witness and he's asking me, can I talk about these things? I don't know. If they're not in evidence yet, he cannot.
If I may, Judge, because I did the questioning on
Okay.
Dr. Scully. So it was, I believe, in the discussion of the negative meconium test, and I was asking her about any evidence that she found in the records that would show that the meconium test
Okay, so
was
his
not.
birth records were not introduced.
They
She
were
testified.
no.
The state didn't object. She testified to hearsay, and it's in front of the jury. So do you have any objection to him testifying to the birth records? You see what I'm saying? There was a lot of perhaps objectionable questions asked, but that were not objected to.
Can I just ask a point of question? Are Dr. Marcus's records in?
Yes. Yes.
Well, that contains the birth records, that of the entire.
Well, then there you go.
And then, Judge, we can also, may I approach the evidence?
Sure.
We can, we provided this to the state with the certificate of authenticity. We can move in all of the adoption records for Nicholas Cruz. There is a caveat. There is some information that has to be redacted pursuant to a
Okay,
court
but
order.
if the adoption records and the birth records are already in evidence, that's all he needs to know. He just wants to be conscientious.
No, I understand, but I don't believe that the adoption records are in. Dr. Marcus's records included the birth records. So we can move in the adoption records now. We have a certificate. And then that would take care of all of it.
State,
No objection.
okay? Dr. Connor, are you following all of that?
Not completely.
Okay, what's in the adoption records and the birth records, you can testify to. First of all, you can give your opinion based upon the knowledge that you have without saying where you got the knowledge from. Do you see what I'm saying? But if you use the birth records and the adoption records as a basis for your opinion, they are in evidence, you can testify to them. The fact that the mother was using drugs and alcohol during her pregnancy is a fact that's in evidence, has been testified to. You may testify to that as well. However,
Very well.
any conversation between the biological mother and Dr. Heather Holmes, you may not talk about.
Very well.
Okay? Hold on just a second. And if you have, yes. And if you have any questions, because I understand we're asking you to testify here in a vacuum, just say, Judge, can I answer that? And I'm happy to help, okay?
Okay.
I know it's gotten a little...
Dr. Connor, because it needs to point some things out on the screen, is going to be controlling the PowerPoint. And so Mr. Ian just asked me to ask Dr. Connor to test that out to make sure it works. Is that okay with Your Honor?
Sure.
Let's see. Oops. Hang on a moment, please. Okay, are you able to see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and let me start the slide deck so that we can make sure that works too. Oh, that puts it way over there. Okay, interesting. Are you seeing the full screenshot, or are you seeing with the file name and stuff like that around it?
Yeah, I'm seeing the main screen, and then on the left-hand side of the screen is the enumerated slides that are forthcoming.
Okay, so it does or it does not have the like home, insert, design, transitions, that sort of thing.
It just
Okay. Here's the question. Can you see my mouse moving?
Yes, sir.
You can.
Yes, sir.
Can you see my mouse moving?
No, sir.
Nope. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing. It's not doing the right thing. Escape. And let's try this. Screen share. That screen. Dang it. Problem that I'm running into is when I go into screen share mode, it does not show the full slides on that screen. So let's try it this way. Let's do the full screen now. Why are you putting it over there? I don't want it over there.
Okay, are we all set?
We're working on it.
These jurors are very patient people. My goodness.
I think I have it now. Let's try this. Okay, now do you see it as a full screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so no file or anything like that around it, correct?
Correct.
Okay, great. That's sorted then.
Judge, do we want to check the jurors' screens before they come in?
Great idea.
Doc, will you restart the PowerPoint, please?
But I thought you saw.
Okay, you are very
We-
quiet.
We checked it.
Mr. Secor?
Ian saw it when it was up. Right? Okay, all right.
And also, I cannot see Mr. Cruz at this point. I can only see Judge Scherer.
Can you see him now, Doc?
Our
Yes.
Our IT guy, our IT professional, Ian, will put me on when I'm swearing you in or when I'm talking, but otherwise you'll be able to see the
Okay.
all of the lawyers. But thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Okay.
What is the defense strategy and the numbers, please?
But I can give you what's marked.
You don't have it? No, I have it.
I'm just gonna fix it to make it easier for board times, but it's the same, it'll be the same mark.
But I need to know, I need to put it on the record because I received it. So where are the IDs?
So I have 3C,
All right, 3C will be received without objection as defense 84.
3D, because they're separated.
How many different things? No, just tell me.
3 big ones, so it'll be
3C, 3D, and 3E.
Yep.
All right, 3C for identification is received as 84, 3D, 85, and 3E, 86. All right, lawyers, we're gonna go till 1 o'clock. And then we'll take a lunch break, but we need to get these jurors in here and get moving.
Yes, ma'am.
So please bring in jury, thank you.
Jurors are entering.
Okay, the jurors are present. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the most stressful jobs for the judge is accommodating or not the jury. And I just want to say that you all are so patient. And I really, really appreciate it because I get very stressed when we keep you waiting. It's nobody's fault. Blame it on me if you need to blame anyone. Sometimes things come up. We think it's gonna just take a few minutes. As you know, you were brought out into the hallway and then back and forth. And there's just, sometimes we cannot anticipate the length of time that certain legal issues take for us to hash out. I assure you, if I knew we weren't gonna be starting until after 11:30, I would not have had you here at 9 a.m. So I apologize, but thank you very, very much for your patience. You have no idea how much less stress it is for me because you all are so great, so thank you. Okay, Dr. Connor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. You can put your hand down. Please state your full name for the record.
My name is Paul David Connor. Last name is spelled Connor.
And for the record, I have identified you in order to swear you in by your Washington driver's license. Mr. Secor, when you're ready, you may inquire.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Connor.
Good morning.
If you just tell the jury, please, what your current occupation is.
I am a clinical neuropsychologist in private practice in Des Moines, Washington.
And please describe to us your educational background.
I'm sorry, you're a little bit quiet. I apologize.
Please describe to us your educational background.
Okay. I received a Bachelor of Science from the University of Washington in 1988. Received a Ph.D. in clinical psychology with a specialization in neuropsychology from Brigham Young University in 1995. As part of that training, I did a one-year internship at Henry Ford Health System in Detroit, Michigan, also specializing in neuropsychology. Then I served as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Washington's Fetal Alcohol and Drug Unit, doing research on individuals with FASDs.
And as a postdoctoral fellow, what was your specialization?
Again, it was in neuropsychology
Okay.
and fetal alcohol spectrum disorders.
And any teaching positions that you've had?
Once I finished with the postdoctoral fellowship, I was an acting instructor and then moved through the faculty ranks to the level of assistant professor. That was purely in a research capacity. I was not doing, I was not giving quarter-long classes. That was in the research track.
All right. And what if you have you had been part of or published any journal articles or studies that you've been part of?
Yes.
And can you describe what those have been primarily based on?
Predominantly, they have related to the neuropsychological and mental health and other aspects of research on individuals with FASD.
Okay. And when you say FASD, what does that stand for?
Yes, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders.
Okay. And have you ever testified as an expert in these fields?
Yes, I have.
And do you have any idea approximately how many times?
About close to 50 at this point.
And in what states, do you know?
Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, Nevada, Texas, Florida, several other states, Tennessee, the Carolinas, and a number of other states that I'm just not thinking of off the top of my head.
Okay. And when you have testified, have you testified before on behalf of a person who is charged with a crime?
I have.
Okay. And when I say testified on behalf, I just mean you were called by the lawyers representing that person. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
I've also been called by the prosecution.
Okay. And have you done any, in terms of your work with the prosecution, describe to us what that has been?
Typically, that involves assessing the victim in a case. I also am called by the state in cases where I am doing assessments of usually parents for the Child Protective Services. I'm contracted to do assessments of their parents. And so I'm doing these assessments, and from time to time I'm being called because the case goes to a termination hearing. So usually when I'm called by the prosecution in those cases.
Okay. And so am I right that if you're testifying that that's considered a forensic case, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, especially with the CPS cases, those are initially a clinical case. They're trying to find out how to work with the parents, things like that. But eventually, if it does go to termination hearing, then it does move into a forensic side.
Okay. And when you're working forensically, what is your hourly rate?
At this point, it is $350 an hour, $350 an hour. When I became involved in this case, it was at $325 an hour.
Okay. And do you have an approximation of the number of hours you put into this case?
At this point, approximately 145 hours.
Okay. If you would describe it to us, please, a little bit about what you, I know you described to us the forensic aspect of your work, but what else does your private practice entail?
Yeah, the predominance of my work is clinical in private practice, where I see people from a wide range of potential neurological conditions, ages 16 through end of life, and so assessing ADHD, learning disabilities, traumatic brain injuries, strokes, seizures, dementias, but one of my specialty areas is in fetal alcohol spectrum disorders.
Okay.
So I get a number of cases that involve that clinically.
And are you aware of other neuropsychologists who are specializing in fetal alcohol spectrum disorders in the United States?
Unfortunately, in the United States, there are very few. In the adult realm, there are more that work with children.
And what, for purposes of this case, Mr. Cruz's case, what was the referral question that was asked of you from the defense?
I was asked to conduct a neuropsychological evaluation to determine if his current cognitive functioning is consistent with diagnostic guidelines for an FASD.
Okay. Now, I believe that you have created a PowerPoint to aid in your testimony and to provide the jury some visual aids or demonstratives. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I was hoping that you could start off by describing to us what is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
Well, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder itself, it's not actually a diagnosis. It is an umbrella term. And so it's just indicating the overarching term of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders is indicating that there are several specific diagnoses underneath that umbrella. There are medical side diagnoses such as fetal alcohol syndrome, which is where an individual has all the physical features, facial features, small eyes, thin upper lip, smooth philtrum, and short stature, as well as cognitive impairments. There's partial fetal alcohol syndrome where they have some of the physical features, but not all of them. But again, they still have the significant cognitive impairments. And then there's alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, or ARND. And that is a diagnosis where the individual does not have the physical features that you see in fetal alcohol syndrome, but they have the same cognitive impairments. Those are the medical side diagnoses. Beginning in 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that's produced by the American Psychiatric Association came out with a diagnosis that's on the mental health side that relates to fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and that's neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure.
Okay. And so the neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure being a psychiatric diagnosis, that would be your purview, is that correct?
Yeah, that's in my area.
Okay. But based on your knowledge of what alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder is, what would be the difference between a person who has NDPAE versus a person who has ARND?
There is no difference. They're essentially synonymous terms. The only difference to the medical side is that it is focusing on the presence or absence of physical features, while the NDPAE is focusing on the cognitive behavioral side of things. So both of them have that component built into them.
Okay, and just one last point on this. At the bottom, you talk about fetal alcohol effects, and
Right.
is that term still used?
It's not used anymore. Back in 1973 was when fetal alcohol syndrome, the term was coined. In 1978, they coined the term fetal alcohol effects for all the individuals who have some or none of the physical features of FAS, but they have the same cognitive problems. That term was phased out in 1994 when the Institute of Medicine then started using the terms partial fetal alcohol syndrome and ARND. So people that would have in the past been diagnosed with fetal alcohol effects would now be diagnosed with partial fetal alcohol syndrome or ARND.
Okay. And before we move on, I was just hoping that you could describe to the jury the extent to which alcohol has an impact on a growing fetus versus other types of substances of abuse or illegal drugs.
Yeah, I mean, use of any substances in pregnancy can have an impact on the fetus. And we do know that nicotine, cocaine, heroin, all of those can have an impact, at least on the modulation of how the fetus develops. Alcohol, in the research that's been done over now about 50 years, has consistently found very strong impacts on the fetus in multiple areas that were assessed, both from the physical perspective and from the neurological perspective and from the neuropsychological and behavioral perspective.
And so, do I understand you correctly that alcohol, in terms of the effect on the fetus, is worse than those other drugs that you mentioned?
Yes, the research has been very consistently indicating that.
Okay. And would you please tell us what it means for a substance to be a teratogen?
Right. So like I said, there are all those other substances there like nicotine or heroin or cocaine even that can have an impact, but they're not what are called teratogens. A teratogenic substance is something that will kill cells. So let's say that you put a nerve cell into a petri dish and you put alcohol in it. It will kill that cell. That's what a teratogen does. So that's the primary difference, and alcohol does do that.
Okay.
And it's a well-known teratogen.
And in terms of how it gets to a fetus from the mother, can you describe that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the placenta offers no protection. Alcohol will freely pass through the placenta. So within a couple of minutes of mom drinking, consuming alcohol, the baby has an equal proportion of alcohol within its system. Unfortunately, early in pregnancy, the fetus has no liver that's functioning. So it is depending on mom to filter out the alcohol. So the alcohol gets into the system, the fetus's system, very quickly, and it takes a while for it to get out of the system because it's relying on mom to do that.
And based on your experience and research that you've done, is there a time frame within which you know the fetus is affected by alcohol?
In animal studies, we found that as little as 12 hours after exposure, we can see dead cells in the brains or in the developing fetus of mice.
Okay. And will you go to the next slide? I think that there's a visual there. Will you describe what this is to the jury, please?
Yeah, so like I said, they administered alcohol to a pregnant mouse dam mother. And then 12 hours later, they sacrificed the fetus. They used a particular stain that is taken up by cells that are dying or dead. And then they were looking for those cells. Those cells would turn black if they were dead cells. And you notice that this mouse fetus that was exposed to alcohol has a lot of dead cells. And if you look on the right side, those dead cells tend to congregate in the front part of the developing mouse fetus. That part of the mouse is what goes on to become the brain and the face.
Okay. Now, can you describe to us I know that you said that alcohol will kill cells, but what other effects does alcohol have on the cells in a developing fetus?
Yeah, so alcohol has the direct toxic effect, but also as alcohol is being metabolized through the liver, the first metabolite of it is called acetaldehyde. That also is a teratogenic substance. So even while the alcohol is being processed and broken down, the substances that it's producing in that process are also teratogenic and can cause direct impact on the fetus. Alcohol will affect indirectly. It can affect the umbilical cord and impair blood flow from the mother to the fetus through the placenta. And so you can get what we call hypoxic effects, so lack of oxygen or insufficient oxygen. So you can get these indirect effects just from the reduced blood flow through the umbilical cord. And alcohol has an impact on all stages of cell development throughout gestation. So initially, it impacts the generation of cells. It's killing the cells as they're being formed. It then also can impact when cells are replicating or proliferating. They're making more copies of themselves. It can kill those cells. The way that most of the cells are made, and you can kind of see that in the mouse slide, is that they tend to clump in a kind of more central area, and then as they proliferate, then they start moving to the place in the brain where they need to be in the full, complete baby as it's born. And alcohol can stop that process of migration, the movement of those cells. And some of the first autopsy studies that were done actually found what are called heterotopias, or clumps of cells in places where they shouldn't be, right in the middle of white matter, which is basically those are just the phone lines. So the phone lines should be there, but the clump of cells themselves shouldn't be. As the cells get to the places in the brain where they need to be in the final form, they start needing to make connections to different parts of the brain. Alcohol can impact that. It can kill the nerve projections as they're going to other parts of the brain. And then the last part of that process, once we've made those connections between different parts of the brain, we're making a lot of connections that we don't necessarily need. And we need to have a much more efficient connection pattern in order for the brain to function efficiently. And so one of the normal processes of development is that we have what's called pruning or apoptosis, where cells and connections are killed off. They have to be killed off. Because if you think about it, if you got a cell that is here and it's talking to a cell that's here, which it's supposed to do, that's great. Should be exactly doing that. But if you also have a projection that goes from here to the front of the head where it's not supposed to be, you're giving information to this part of the head that it doesn't know how to deal with. And so if you think about it kind of from an electrical perspective, it kind of short circuits the system. You don't want that. But alcohol can stop that process so that you still have that connection to the wrong part of the brain.
You mentioned that alcohol, when it's broken down by the mother's system, that it becomes, I think you said acetaldehyde, is that correct?
Yes.
And at the point you made, that also is a teratogen, right?
Correct.
And of the other substances that you talked about, other drugs of abuse or illegal drugs, do they also become acetaldehyde when broken down by the mother?
No.
Okay. Thank you. I believe if you go to the next slide, Doctor, it's just an example of what can result from prenatal alcohol exposure. If you could describe that to us.
Yeah, I mean, on the most extreme end, it can cause death, either spontaneous miscarriage or failure to thrive soon after birth. It can lead to those physical malformations, the facial features that we see in individuals with FAS and partial FAS. It could lead to growth deficiencies. Individuals with FASD often tend to be quite small, short-statured, often are underweight, at least as children. And then probably the area that's germane to what I do, it causes functional deficits.
And the functional deficits, as a consequence of alcohol exposure, the functional deficits are a consequence of what?
The impacts that the alcohol has on the developing brain of the fetus.
Okay. And the developing brain, that system within the body, that's the central nervous system, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And throughout the course of a woman's pregnancy, is there a time when the central nervous system is particularly vulnerable to the effects of alcohol?
No, it's all throughout pregnancy, from the beginning to the end, where the brain and the CNS is vulnerable.
Okay. I think I'd like to ask you now to describe to the jury the criteria that you use when you're assessing somebody, starting with the Institute of Medicine, if you would.
Okay. Yes, the Institute of Medicine was a group that was called together by a mandate from the federal government to try to develop, I should say, criteria for the diagnosis of, at the time it wasn't called fetal alcohol spectrum disorders because that hadn't been coined yet. This was in 1994. But for FAS and FAE, as part of that, they renamed the diagnoses to fetal alcohol syndrome, partial fetal alcohol syndrome, ARND. There's also another condition called alcohol-related birth defects, which are basically impacts physically, skeletal, heart conditions, liver conditions, things like that. But we don't focus on that as much, especially when it comes to the neuropsychological side of things. But the criteria that relate to the cognitive impacts, the things that are part of what I do for my evaluations through the IOM, was looking for evidence of some sort of CNS abnormalities. It could be structural changes to the brain, decreased size of the brain. It could be kind of neurological signs like motor coordination problems, eye-hand coordination problems, things like that. And then it talks about an evidence of a complex pattern of behavior or cognitive abnormalities that are inconsistent with developmental level, can't be explained by familial background or environment alone. And then it lists a number of possible areas where a person could have impairments. It's not an exhaustive list, and it's not a list that says you have to have all of these. So it talks about, impulse control, school performance, learning disabilities, social perception troubles, language, expressive and receptive, difficulties with abstraction, math, memory, attention, and executive functions like judgment.
And let me just real quickly ask you, based on what's on the screen now, the IOM guidelines, the reason why the criteria A, B, and C are not listed here.
Yeah, A, B, and C have to do with alcohol exposure, the facial features, and growth deficiencies.
Okay.
Again, those are the physical sides are not part of my usual purview.
Okay. And just for clarification, in D, whenever it says CNS, that means what?
Central nervous system, okay. Basically the brain.
All right. Now, would you explain to us how you use those guidelines when you are making your assessment?
Yeah, so I use the IOM as the framework for our assessment, for the assessments that I'm involved in. But I'm not overly happy with the terminology of complex pattern of behavior of or cognitive abnormalities. It's rather nonspecific. In 2004, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, again mandated by the federal government, sat down to try and clarify some of the issues related to the diagnostic criteria. And again, this is just focusing on the neuropsychological or cognitive side of things. They also made comments about the physical side of things. But they, that as part of their the outcome, they set pretty specific criteria that can be replicated very frequently. So they have to have either an IQ that is 2 standard deviations below the mean. That means that the person's IQ score is in the intellectually disabled range, or back in the day, it used to be called mentally retarded range. Or they're demonstrating deficits in 3 domains, 3 areas of functioning that are at least 1 standard deviation below the mean. That means that they are performing worse than at least 84% of the population within those domains. And they go on to say what domains some of the example domains. Again, it was not designed to be an exclusive or an inclusive list. It was designed to be an example of these are the domains that we often see. And you don't have to have every single domain in order for the diagnosis. You just have to have deficits in 3 domains. So cognitive or developmental issues such as academics, also discrepancies where there's big differences between scores, like on IQ or academics. Those are also counted as an indication of the developmental delay. Executive function impairments, planning, problem solving, learning from your mistakes, coming up with new ideas. That's all what kind of executive functioning is, not getting stuck on an idea. Motor coordination, attention, hyperactivity, kind of your classic ADHD sorts of behaviors, social skills, then again, language, memory, things like that are also very commonly were ones that they identified as being common issues.
And just because I think this is going to come up occasionally during your testimony, can you just sort of help us understand the concept of a standard deviation, what that means?
Yeah, so a score, when you take a score, you get a number, a single number. But that's not always the actual number. It can range a bit. So there's some variability there. So when you're looking at the standard scores for a test, let's say a score, an IQ score, on average, an IQ score in the general population is about 100. But that ranges. So about 68% of the population are somewhere between -1 standard deviation and +1 standard deviation. That's kind of the normal range, down to low average range. But there's that range that we typically see that's 1 standard deviation above and 1 standard deviation below the average score.
So in IQ testing, how many points is 1 standard deviation?
That would be a range from 85 to 115. So it's a 15-point difference.
So 1 standard deviation in IQ testing is 15 points. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Is the standard deviation in all types of testing also 15 points?
No. Each different standard score has its own standard deviation, own range. So there's another type of score that's commonly used in neuropsychology called a T-score. And that has an average of 50 and a standard deviation of 10. There's another type of score called a scaled score, and that has an average of 10 and a range of 3, or standard deviation of 3, sorry. And then there's still another one called a Z-score, and that has an average of 0 and a standard deviation of 1.
Okay. All right. If you can move on and describe to us how you use the Institute of Medicine and the CDC together.
Right. So like I said, I'm not as happy with how IOM has this complex pattern that's not really well defined. CDC brings to the table a much more structured criteria. Must have deficits at least 1 standard deviation in at least 3 domains. So it's much more structured. That means that you can apply it reliably across all subjects that you see, all patients that you see. So I see one person and I find that they have 2 deficits in 2 domains. They wouldn't qualify for the diagnosis of an FASD. But if I see a person that has 8 domains, they would qualify. And I can reliably use that same cutoff for every patient that I see. And having the requirement that there be multiple domains of impairment satisfies that the IOM's concept of the complex pattern.
Okay. Next, I was going going to ask you if you could just describe to us generally what a neurodevelopmental disorder is.
Yeah, this is from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that was published by the American Psychiatric Association. They talk about neurodevelopmental disorders as conditions that start in the developmental period in children. They manifest early, and we see deficits in development, deficits in brain processing that impact personal, social, academic, occupational functioning. So it's not enough that they are just doing poorly, it's got to actually impact them in the real world. And so that's why you need both the symptoms and the impact, the impaired functioning in day-to-day life.
And based on your experience and knowledge and education, are neurodevelopmental disorders, are they caused by a specific thing?
They can be caused by many different things. Neurodevelopmental disorders is again a grouping. So intellectual disability falls within the neurodevelopmental disorder range, as does learning disabilities, as does ADHD. They can be caused by a lot of different reasons that we may not ever know.
Okay. Is there a recognized neurodevelopmental disorder that's considered to be caused by in utero alcohol exposure to a fetus?
Yeah, one of the diagnoses in the neurodevelopmental disorders section is called other specified neurodevelopmental disorders. So this is basically, they don't necessarily meet criteria for intellectual disability. They don't necessarily meet criteria for ADHD. There's something different about them. But they are definitely demonstrating a neurodevelopmental disorder. The only example of that type of disorder that it poses or that it gives in the DSM is neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. So neurodevelopmental disorder that's associated with prenatal alcohol exposure, characterized by a range of developmental disabilities following exposure to alcohol in utero.
And am I right that this description of it here that's in the DSM is sort of similar to what you said about the IOM's criteria? It's not particularly specific. Is that right?
No, unfortunately it's not.
And can you apply the CDC criteria to this the same way you did to the Institute of Medicine?
Yes, very much so. Again, it's being relatively, non-specific, but the same issues of creating a much more structured and reliably reproducible set of cut points, essentially, where you're having to find deficits in multiple domains that are impacting their functioning, is very much in keeping with a way of operationalizing the neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure.
And before we move on, can you just tell us what the F88 stands for on that slide?
F88 is a billing code. It's a diagnosis code, honestly. So if you have an individual that has an other specified neurodevelopmental disorder and you categorize it as the neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure, you cite that code. And it is a recognized diagnosis, and it's one that can be used for billing purposes.
Okay. Now, I would like you to describe to the jury the difference between that neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure versus what also appears in the DSM, neurobehavioral disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure.
Yeah, so this neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure shows up in the front sections of the DSM. These are the diagnosis sections, the actual diagnoses. In a back section of the DSM-5 and DSM-5-TR, it has a section of conditions in need of further study. And in that section, there is the term neurobehavioral disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. And so they have they've proposed a series of guidelines, diagnostic guidelines that can be used to identify this neurobehavioral disorder.
And you appear to use the same acronym. Is that correct? NDPAE?
They do.
Okay. Now, based on your expertise, even though they both have the same acronym, but is neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure the same thing as neurobehavioral disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure?
Likely. I mean, right now in the DSM for the diagnosis, it does say neurodevelopmental disorder. So that's what I use for the diagnosis. But they're trying to get at the same sort of thing, the impact of prenatal exposure on offspring throughout their lives.
Okay. Now, you mentioned one thing that I just want to make sure we're on the same page. You mentioned the DSM-5 and the DSM-5 TR. What's TR? TR is for text revision. So the DSM has editions up through now 5. DSM-5 was released in 2013. Usually as part of kind of a mid-cycle refresh, shall we say, they release a second version of the DSM-5, and it's called the text revision. And so what they do in that is that they talk about research that's been done in the ensuing several years. Sorry, this was released in 2022, just a few months ago. So it talks about the research that's been done in over the years since the DSM-5 was published. And so it adds information, text, to like associated features, treatment modalities, and things like that. The DSM-5 TR does not change the diagnostic criteria. That's not part of its mandate. It's designed to look at what the research has been over a few years and kind of that are associated with the diagnoses, but not the actual criteria. So between publication of the DSM-5 in 2013 and the DSM-5 TR in 2022, is there any change whatsoever to neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure or neurobehavioral disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure?
No.
All right. Can you describe to us what the diagnostic features are for neurobehavioral disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure?
Yeah, so again, impairment in cognitive, behavioral, adaptive functioning with prenatal exposure. You can use multiple different sources to find that information, whether it be records, prior evaluations, etc. But we're looking for neurocognitive impairments, impairments in self-regulation, so mood dysregulation, being really unstable with your moods and up and down, things like that. Attention deficits, impulse control problems, things like that. And then also impairments in adaptive functioning, communication, social interaction, social communication, daily living sorts of skills, being able to keep yourself clean, managing the household, things like that. And also it talks about motor skills. So those are kind of the 3 primary areas that it talks about for areas of impairment that you're looking for.
And I know you gave some examples of neurocognitive impairments there, but can you just sort of help me when I hear the word neurocognitive? What should I be thinking about?
Yeah, again, so this is the area that's kind of my central bailiwick, which is executive function problems, planning, problem solving, abstract reasoning, learning and memory, academic problems, visual spatial problems, things like that.
Okay. And then, so do you apply the CDC criteria to this as well?
I do, because again, it's talking about impairments in these areas, and these are areas that the neuropsych will assess. But again, more structured criteria that can be applied across multiple cases. So you're not relying as heavily on kind of the clinical judgment of it kind of looks about like it, so let's kind of sneak it in. No, they need to meet that minimum criteria.
All right. And You said, I can't remember the exact terminology that you said about your referral question, but was to assess Nick's neurocognitive functioning. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And how do you do that?
Well, the assessment that I do is based off of a series of tests, and these tests measure the functioning of the brain. I'm not diagnosing or directly measuring brain damage. That's actually a medical term. I'm looking at the function of the brain, and so I'd be looking for brain dysfunction. The tests that have been developed in the field of neuropsychology over many, many years, 100 years by now, probably. Usually we learned them originally from somebody who's had some sort of an injury. And then we do a lot of tests, or we interview them, and we develop tests to measure what those areas of impact. So people like Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker, was tamping down dynamite into a hole in order to blast the side of a hill. Unfortunately, the tamping rod set up the dynamite. The tamping rod went up through around his orbit, through his brain. From that, he had significant behavioral changes and cognitive changes. And from that, we were learning that the frontal lobes tend to be involved with kind of these higher behavioral and higher cognitive functioning. And then through the research also with other individuals, we've learned about kind of locally what parts of the brain tend to be more involved in certain aspects, like memory, being more involved in kind of temporal lobe damage, things like that. And regardless, in the neuropsych, I'm looking for areas of significant deficit, and that's, I think I mentioned already, where basically 84% of the population does better on this test than the person that I'm testing. So that indicates that they're within the impaired range. And then that is further broken down into levels of severity. So if they're very close to that, if they're in, at the 13th percentile or so, that's mildly impaired. Still significant, but it's mildly impaired. It can also be moderately impaired, much more significantly impacted, or severely impaired, where maybe less than 1% of the population or 99% of the population does better than this person. When it comes to fetal alcohol syndrome, though, or fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, though, because we know from the research over the years that alcohol damages the brain, we have the autopsy studies, we have the animal studies that show it has causes direct damage to the brain. Really, when you're diagnosing, when FASD ends up being diagnosed, it does mean that there's brain damage involved.
And just going up to where you mentioned that significant deficit means that more than 84% of the population perform better. Is that one standard deviation?
It is.
Okay. All right. So if you will just continue on, tell us what it is that you are attempting to identify with the testing that you do.
Yeah, I'm looking for strengths and weaknesses. Everybody's got strengths and weaknesses. We're looking for, in this case, Mr. Cruz's particular set. From that, I'm looking to see how his performance on the testing is or isn't consistent with research on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and the diagnostic guidelines. I look at the timeline of cognitive impacts. So when I do the testing, it's how is he doing, basically right now in 2021 when the testing was done. But I also look at the previous records for prior testing that had been done throughout the individual's life to look to see if there's consistency across time. If a person is having impairments now, but let's say when they were 17 years old, they were doing absolutely fine, no problems, all the way up until that point, and then suddenly they're doing poorly. That's not a pattern that I expect to see for FASD. I'm expecting to see problems earlier in life on cognitive testing and participation in special education services and things like that. I do acknowledge that there are other potential causes for cognitive impairments, and I identify them when I need to. I render the opinion of whether the neuropsych testing is consistent with an FASD guideline, and then it would be referred on to the medical doctor to do their evaluation and to determine if one of the medical diagnoses partial fetal alcohol syndrome, or ARND would be warranted.
And when you talk about identifying competing causes, is that to say that your testing can identify if it's likely not fetal alcohol spectrum disorder?
It can, especially if the pattern is very much incompatible with what we expect to see. But sometimes there can be other conditions that we know about, like a person has had significant head injuries or stroke or things like that. Then we can look to see if the pattern is more or less consistent with a head injury versus the fetal alcohol.
Okay.
And that's what goes into the decision making for the medical doctor when they're making their diagnosis too.
Now, what if a person does have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? What is your hypothesis about what you're going to see in their testing?
Yeah, I rarely expect to see them have IQs that are within the intellectually disabled range. The research that we've done over the years has found that yes, IQ is impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure. It's lower in individuals with FAS, and in the research that we were doing at the University of Washington, at that time we were calling it fetal alcohol effects. Now we do partial FAS and ARND. Yes, the IQ scores were lower, but only about 20% or so of individuals with FASDs had IQs that were within the intellectually disabled range. So I don't expect to see that on a routine basis. I usually will expect to see patchy functioning. They do well in one area, do poorly in another area. Everybody has some variability because, we're better in some areas and worse in other areas, but I tend to see that exaggerated much more significantly and much larger differences between strengths and weaknesses. Academically, I do expect to see impairments. Many of the individuals with FASD go through or receive an IEP or exceptional student status. So I do expect to see academic impairments. Oftentimes math is most significantly impacted. It's not always the case though. I do usually expect to see visual spatial construction deficits. So being able to look at something complex and recreate it is very difficult for individuals with FASD. We've been seeing that in the research since the 80s. I very often will see social and adaptive impairments, again, doing worse than you expect based off of their IQ. And often those adaptive skills are measured to be within the range of intellectual disability. So even though the IQ may be in the normal range, their ability to apply that on a day-to-day basis is often within that intellectually disabled range. So there's this disconnection. Executive function deficits, these higher order things of planning and problem solving, generating ideas, we often will see impairments there. Often we see that even more in tasks that are less structured or settings that are less structured. When I do an executive function test, some of them I tell you exactly how you're supposed to solve the problem. I give you all the rules. And those are pretty highly structured. You just have to do the task. Other executive function tests, I give you the test and say, you got to figure it out. Have fun. So I don't give any instructions. They have to figure all of that on their own. So that's a much lower structure, requires a lot more effort on their part to be able to figure out how to solve the problems. The other thing that we very commonly will see is variability over time. So teachers and parents have commented on this ever since I've been involved in the field. One day, Johnny, we can teach him this thing. He understands it. He's able to get it. It's great. And then 2 days later, it's almost like he's never seen this before. And then maybe a week later, he gets it again. So it's this variability across time we do tend to see in individuals with FASD.
And these, would I be correct to say that these are all indicative of cognitive impairment? Is that right?
Yes, cognitive, behavioral, and adaptive impairments, yes.
Okay. And have these kinds of cognitive and behavioral impairments from prenatal prenatal alcohol exposure been able to be demonstrated in animal studies?
Yes. Yes, they have. There's one study in particular that that was done back in the 80s. What you've got is this room with a window in it, food source on the other side of the window. You put a normal chick, normally developing chick, you put it into this room, which by the way does have a door out the back side. You put the chicken into the room, it sees the food, it runs towards the food, it'll bonk its beak on the window. May do that a couple times, but eventually it will decide that's not the best choice. It'll start looking around, it'll find this door, go out, get the food, be very happy. You grab the chick, put it back into the room. May take a couple of trials, but very quickly it learns, go out the door, get to the food. And it learns that skill very quickly. You take the chick away, and maybe a couple weeks later, you put it back into the same room again. It may take a couple of tries again to remember, but very quickly it remembers, oh yes, I need to go out this door, gets to the food. It's a happy camper. You take a chick that's been exposed to alcohol in the egg. It sees the food, runs towards the food, bonks its beak on the window, picks itself up, sees the food, runs towards the food, bonks its beak on the window, picks itself up. It does it over and over again. What we call it in the neuropsych field is perseverations, doing the same thing over and over, even if it's not beneficial for you. It may eventually find the door, get out, get to the food. It becomes a happy camper. You grab it, put it back into the room, it sees the food, runs towards the food, bonks its beak on the window, picks itself up, sees the food, runs towards the food, bonks its beak on the window. It has a very hard time learning how to solve the problem. It may eventually learn it. It takes a lot of extra practice, a lot more than the control chick ever did. A couple weeks later, you put the chick back in. It's almost like it's never seen this before. Sees the food, runs towards the food, bonks its beak on the window. It has to completely relearn again. It has not remembered the strategy.
Thank you. And I just want to make sure that I'm right about a couple of things. The term fetal alcohol effects, or FAE, that is not used anymore. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what are the current conditions that we refer to now that would have previously been referred to as FAE?
So partial fetal alcohol syndrome, PFAS, or alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, ARND.
Okay. So PFAS and ARND are what we used to call FAE. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
And then the other population of people with FASD is people who have fetal alcohol syndrome. Is that correct?
Yes.
So can you help us understand how the IQ differs between the normal population, people with FAE, and people with FAS?
Yeah, as far as IQ goes, full scale IQ, there is a slight step down. Normal population average score is 100. In the FAE, or now PFAS ARND community or group, the average score, IQ score is 90. And within the FAS group, the average score was 79. So within the borderline range. But again, like I said, still only about 20% that were within the intellectually disabled range. The other thing about IQs is that in the studies that we were doing in the 90s at the University of Washington, we found a very large range of scores. Anywhere from, a score of 20, which is profoundly intellectually disabled, all the way up to scores in the 120 range. So very wide range. So really IQ in and of itself, the full scale IQ, isn't all that helpful when it comes to fetal alcohol spectrum disorders diagnosis. What we do tend to see is more variability across IQ domains. So when you do an IQ test, you look at verbal skills, you look at nonverbal skills. Nowadays, we're looking at kind of working memory or working memory sorts of skills, or processing speed sorts of skills. And we tend to see much bigger discrepancies between those different domains in individuals with FASD.
You mentioned that one of the things that is considered in your assessment is adaptive functioning. Can you please just describe to us what adaptive functioning is?
Yeah, it's basically how a person can apply knowledge that they have on a day-to-day basis independently without extra help, without help from others. So can they meet standards in the community of, taking care of themselves, of their ability to communicate, of their ability to interact with others? And usually when we look at adaptive functioning, it's we're looking at those three areas: the kind of day-to-day skills, communication, and social interaction, social perceptions, things like that.
Okay. And so you said it includes the conceptual domain. Is that the one you just described?
Yeah, conceptual domain includes kind of communication issues, ability to apply knowledge, and things like that.
Okay. Now, you touched on this a minute ago when you were talking about the IQ, but can you give us a sense of, in terms of people that have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, their IQ versus their academic performance versus their adaptive functioning, and what you tend to see based on your experience, how those three things relate to one another?
Right. We very commonly will see this descending pattern where IQ is up here, maybe in average, low average range. Academics are lower than you'd expect based off of IQ, kind of a pattern that you would see in learning disabilities. But then adaptive skills are much, much lower. Again, that ability to apply the knowledge, like you get from the IQ, on a day-to-day basis, much, much lower. Like I said before, oftentimes their scores are actually within the intellectually disabled range by comparison to an IQ that may not be anywhere close to that.
And I think you said that people that are diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome tend to have the lower IQs. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then people with FAEs, which includes partial fetal alcohol syndrome and alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, they have lower IQs, but not as low as FAS individuals. Is that right? On average,
yes.
But in terms of what you just described, the discrepancy between IQ, academic functioning, and adaptive behavior, is that across the board for people that have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder?
It tends to be worse for those with the FAE, the ARND partial fetal alcohol, because their IQs tend to be a little bit higher, but they're having almost the same level of impairment adaptively as individuals with FAS. So the discrepancy is even more extreme.
Okay. Along that same line, I was wanting you to describe to us the concept of secondary disabilities within the realm of people who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders.
Yeah, so secondary disabilities are problems that a person faces in their daily life that aren't directly caused by the alcohol and the damage to the brain, but they kind of come as a result of that. So having impairments in cognitive functioning and math calculation puts you into positions where you have more academic difficulties. That academic difficulty is a secondary to the underlying neurological issue of the impact of the alcohol to the brain. We can look at that in a lot of different areas. So the secondary impact of alcohol on the disrupted school experiences. People with FASDs tend to have much higher dropout rates, suspension rates, expulsion rates. They do tend to get into trouble with the law considerably, quite frequently. And individuals with FAS, with what used to be FAE or partial FAS, ARND, oftentimes have greater difficulties, greater secondary disabilities than the people with fetal alcohol syndrome. Seems kind of counterintuitive considering their IQ tends to be a little bit higher, but think about somebody with, let's say, Down syndrome. You look at a child with Down syndrome, you see a very specific facial feature. you know, okay, this person has some difficulties. We recognize the face of Down syndrome. So we tend to provide more services for that person, tend to give them a lot more supports. Same thing happens with fetal alcohol syndrome. They are unusual looking kids. They have this very characteristic set of facial features. Oftentimes are very short statured. They get recognized earlier. They get diagnosed earlier oftentimes. And so they get the services that they need that are appropriate to them. So they oftentimes actually have less troubles with all these secondary disabilities because they're getting those supports. The people with the partial FAS or ARND, they don't have a lot of those physical features. They can get missed much more easily. So we assume they should do just fine because they don't look odd. And so they aren't necessarily getting supports. They may be getting diagnosed much later in life. So they're not getting the supports and services that are appropriate to an individual with FASD. So they tend to have greater difficulties in many of these areas.
And do those secondary disabilities involve, I know you said, I think you said problems with the law, but what types of things, based on your expertise, do you see in terms of those secondary disabilities?
Yes, it could be troubles with the law, and it's a whole range from, property crimes all the way up to, in our case, murder cases. As far as troubles with the law, but again, school experiences, being confined, whether it be for criminal cases, mental health confinements, or substance use confinements, things like that. Alcohol use problems, again, very common in individuals with FASD themselves. And so in all of those areas, we see this increased rate of these secondary disabilities.
All right. Can you describe to us the actual neuropsychological testing battery that you have put together and how it was that you came to put it together the way that you have?
Okay. The battery is based off of research that either I've done as when I was at the University of Washington doing assessments of adults who had been diagnosed with FASD in the research, and other groups around the country who have done assessments and research on individuals with FASD. And so from that, we're looking at a number of domains that are salient to the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure. Some of these are direct tests that we used, or versions of the same test that we use in the research that I carry over. Others are measuring similar skills to what we found in research, although the research test that we used wasn't clinically based, so we needed to find a clinical test that was measuring basically the same thing. So from that, I assembled this battery of tests that I will typically administer in my cases when I see somebody who is suspected of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
And you said you've been involved in this research since when?
Since 1995.
Okay. And now these various acronyms on this page, are they names of a given test?
Yes, and I'm looking at the different domains. So there's the IQ domain, intellectual functioning, and one of the predominant tests that's used is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. I will usually use that test. There are other IQ tests that are out there. Achievement testing, when I do the assessments, I usually am using the wide range achievement, but there's also the Wechsler individual achievement tests that can be used. There are a number of other tests that are measuring the same sort of thing. Again, visual spatial construction, there are these certain tests that I typically will use.
Okay. And are these are tests, you haven't created these tests, is that right?
No,
okay.
No.
And the reason why you have this battery is over time you have found what about this battery?
That the tests that were used in these tests are either the same as or are measuring the same function as was used in the research, and they were tests and skills that we know from the research to be impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure.
Okay. And forgive me if you've mentioned this, but is this a battery that you have published?
Yes, we published a set of guidelines for our diagnostic process in 2010, 2011, I think is when it officially came out, that talked about the protocol of, you know, how we apply the Institute of Medicine and the CDC criteria, and listed a number of these tests. It's been refined a little bit over the years, and just recently in 2021, a book was published in which I wrote a chapter that updated the neuropsychological side of the assessment process for FASD, and so it has an updated listing of recommended tests that would be used when assessing for FASD.
As part of your assessment, do you review records on the patient or the defendant or whomever it may be?
Yes.
And can you please explain to us why that is?
Like I said before, from the neuropsychological side of things, I'm looking at their current functioning, but I want to be able to document or understand that they were demonstrating cognitive difficulties earlier in life, and not just suddenly right now. So I review those records. Predominantly those would be school records, prior psychological records, prior neuropsychological records if they've been done, medical records, especially if there were other kind of neurological issues, traumatic brain injuries, strokes, things like that that might have occurred, seizures, sorry. So those are the sorts of records that I look at. We also look at records relating to prenatal exposures to see if there's documentation of that in the record.
Okay. And can you tell us about, for purposes of this case, what records you reviewed that you found to be relevant to your assessment?
Again, predominantly the school records. There were a couple of psychological evaluations done when he was younger that were done that had testing that were pertinent. Some medical records, including adoption records and birth records, that were pertinent for the issues of exposure history.
Okay. And when you say exposure history, we're talking about prenatal alcohol exposure history. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And please tell us what you found that was important to you in the adoption records.
Brenda Woodward.
Let me just stop you for a second. Brenda Woodward is who?
Is Mr. Cruz's biological mother.
Thank you.
When she was, this was in adoption records, when she first completed the paperwork for adoption, she was putting Mr. Cruz up for adoption. She acknowledged drinking beer 3 times a week during the first 5 weeks of pregnancy. She also, she denied cocaine use, but talked about smoking cigarettes as well. Later in the pregnancy, in July, she reported past use of drugs and substance use treatment being involved in it, but acknowledging drinking beer during the first 3 months of pregnancy and smoking a pack of cigarettes daily, which was an increase from her report from March of 1998, which is not at all uncommon to see kind of as a person is more willing to discuss, then they tend to report higher levels of substance use.
All right. Now, what about the birth records? What did you find important to you in those?
Yeah, in the birth record itself, there's significant psychosocial history. It says patient admits to alcohol abuse, states a little bit fuzzy, but I think it says currently in treatment center. So she was acknowledging alcohol abuse and that she was involved in treatment.
And from your expertise as a neuropsychologist, is there any significance to using the word abuse in a record like this?
Yeah, I mean, abuse usually indicates a level of magnitude more use of alcohol. It's causing more problems for the person, things like that. They're using greater quantities, greater frequency, and it's, like I said, it's causing them difficulties in some aspects of their social life versus just, yeah, I have had a drink. I have used alcohol.
Okay. And based on what you have reviewed in this case that pertains to Brenda's drinking while pregnant, you've mentioned the adoption records and the birth records. Are you aware of other sources that have confirmed that she was drinking and or using drugs while pregnant?
My understanding that there was testimony earlier by Carolyn Deakins, who was a friend of Miss Woodward, who testified to alcohol use during pregnancy, and also her daughter, Danielle Woodward, who had testified to alcohol use during pregnancy.
All right. Now, in these cases, is this a level of documentation about drinking while pregnant that you are accustomed to finding?
In some ways, it's actually more than we're accustomed to finding. We don't often find contemporaneous, meaning at the time of the pregnancy. We don't always get contemporaneous records that talk about using alcohol during pregnancy. So this was kind of an additional level to what we normally would expect to see. So this was, well before involvement in this case. It's known that alcohol use was on board during the course of the pregnancy.
All right. I'd like to ask you to begin describing to us the actual neuropsychological assessment that you did of Nick, and we'll just, I'm assuming that you began with the battery that you've already showed us. Is that correct?
Yes, in this case, testing was actually split between myself and another doctor, another neuropsychologist, because of there were questions about possible autism spectrum disorder, things like that. So the testing was split up between us. I was focusing on the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder side, and Dr. Black was focusing on the autism spectrum side. But all the data can be brought together for either, and in the end, it was brought together for the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder side of things.
And did you incorporate any of the tests that Dr. Black did into your assessment?
I did.
Did you incorporate all of the testing that he did?
No.
Why is that?
Some of the testing that Dr. Black had done were tests that are primarily focusing on autism spectrum disorders, and that isn't part of what we're looking at for the FASD now. He'd looked at it for the autism spectrum. It wasn't seeming as fruitful, so the focus shifted. He also gave a couple of self-report measures of that Mr. Cruz filled out, basically, of his behavior, which is something that his understanding of his cognitive functioning, which I tend not to do, especially in individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. We often see that they are pretty suggestible. And so if you give them a test that says, do you do this, do you do that, they may have a tendency to say, yeah, I do, hey, because they're being because it's suggestibility rather than they actually are having these sorts of problems. So I tend not to give self-report measures, so I didn't include those in my battery when I blended the two batteries together.
And the test that you included in your battery that Dr. Black actually administered, did you do anything to verify the accuracy of the scoring that he did?
Yes, both he and I double-checked the scoring. We did find a couple of small errors that were corrected. Didn't change the interpretation in any way, but they were corrected quite a long time ago.
So why not just re-give Nick the test that Dr. Black did instead of using Dr. Black's scores?
Yeah, well, many of the tests that we give in neuropsychology can be impacted by practice. So if you give the same test twice, it's not at all unexpected to see them get better the second time you give the same test. And in fact, it's kind of expressly told not to for a number of tests, that you need to give it a good period of time before you re-administer a test. So on those tests that it would be inappropriate to re-administer because it might decrease the validity of the test, I didn't re-administer them.
And is that what you just described, is that something that is sort of a part of neuropsychological testing, is the concept that you can't give somebody the same test in close proximity?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, I'd like to ask you to describe the various testing that you did of Nick, and if you would first start with what I think you call effort testing, and tell the jury what that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as part of the evaluation, I want to make sure that Mr. Cruz is working hard. He's trying his best. He's not, lollygagging. He's not, ignoring me. He's not actively trying to show himself to be doing poorly. So in order to do that, we administered a number of tests that measure the validity of their testing throughout the course of the evaluation. Not all clumped together, but spread out. Some of these tests are embedded in other tests, and others are kind of standalone tests. And so they're taken together, they're called performance validity tests. There's actually two types of effort testing or validity testing that's out there. This type, the performance validity, is looking at cognitive and neuropsychological validity on tests that are similar to things that I'm giving, that I'm measuring, let's say memory. We're giving memory tests that look hard. They're not actually very hard. So we're looking to see if they're what their performance is and whether they're putting out strong effort. Another type of validity test is what's called symptom validity. So this is more relating to mental health side of things. Their depression, their anxiety, their unusual experiences, psychotic symptoms, things like that. Those symptom validities are questionnaires usually that relate to, have you had troubles with this in your life? Have you tried troubles with that in your life? And so it's asking these drawing these more questions of behavior. I'm not focusing on that with the neuropsychological evaluation. I want to see how they do on cognitive sorts of tests. So this is a listing of the tests that were administered throughout the course of the evaluations, both by me and Dr. Black. Again, spread out. We don't tell them, hey, this is the effort test now. You gotta work hard on this. No, this is another test. And in all of those tests, Mr. Cruz was putting out very good effort. He was making very few errors, and he was working quite quickly on the tasks. So these were all showing that he was working hard throughout the course of the days of the assessment.
Is effort testing similar to what people call testing for malingering?
Yes. One end of the effort spectrum is malingering, the very far end, where a person is attempting to fake their performance for a secondary gain, whether it be for money, if it's a civil case, or for in a criminal case to try and evade the consequences. That's just one extreme end. There's all kinds of other ways that a person could be putting out poor efforts. They could be very tired that day. They could be sick. They could not like me, think I'm a jerk, and not want to work for me. So there's all kinds of reasons why a person could be doing poorly on these effort tests. One of them is that they might be malingering.
Okay. And if malingering is at one end of the spectrum, is it correct that Nick scored on the other end of the spectrum?
Yes.
Now, if you would describe to us what you discovered regarding Nick's IQ based on your or Dr. Black's testing.
Right. So these are the domain level scores on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale that were administered to Mr. Cruz, and then the full scale IQ. The full scale IQ was an 83. That is in the low average range. It's actually slightly lower than what we've seen in our research on individuals with FAE, so partial FAS, ARND. The other thing that we note on the the intellectual testing is across those domains, there is significant variability between his high score, 93, which is very much in the average range, and a low score on working memory, which is in the borderline range. So much lower, many points difference between these two. So that variability across domains, like I said, I do tend to expect to see. I am seeing on the testing that was done with Mr. Cruz.
And so is
Similar
I'm
similar variability across the subtests, where he's got scores that are in the mildly impaired range up to very much in the average range.
And is this performance on IQ testing what you would anticipate seeing in a person who has a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder?
Yes, like I said, his full-scale IQ is a little bit lower than somebody with ARND, or the research on individuals with ARND or partial FAS on average. But yes, it's very much in keeping with what I would expect to see.
Okay. Now, if you could describe to us how he scored in the various neuropsychological domains that you tested him for.
Right. So you can do that by just showing a person a bunch of scores, bunch of numbers. But for me, it seems to help a little bit to look at a picture, basically, of a person's scores. And that gives you a visual representation of where they have strengths, where they have weaknesses. So I create this graph in order to do that. Like I'd said before, there are a bunch of different types of scores that we see in neuropsychological testing. So sometimes an IQ score with a mean of 100, T scores with a mean of 50, scale scores with a mean of 10. That gets really confusing to tell which one's which, even for us. We need to know what tests creates what scores. So in order to kind of get around that, comparing apples to oranges, we convert all of the scores to a single standard score, a Z score. That was that one that I told you had a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. All the scores get converted to that. It doesn't change the range of the scores. It doesn't change any of that. If it's 1 standard deviation below the mean, it's 84% of the population or 86% of the population does better. It stays exactly the same, just everything's on a same scale so that we can compare across. One of the other downsides of neuropsychological and psychological testing is sometimes a high score is good, sometimes a high score is bad. You have to know the test in order to figure that out. So I convert everything so that a low score means bad performance. All that is flipping the sign. Doesn't change the valence, just flips the sign. Or doesn't change the value, it just flips the sign so that the low score is poor.
Okay, Mr. Seeker, I think we're going to take a break for lunch now, okay? Ladies and gentlemen, it's 1 o'clock. Please be back at 2:30, promptly at 2:30 so we can start back up. Please do not discuss the case. Please leave your notepads behind. We'll see you at 2:30. Thank you. Okay, the jurors have been excused. We're in recess.
IQ as compared to his academic ability as compared to his adaptive functioning.
Mm-hmm. Oops, sorry. So yeah, this is Mr. Cruz scores on the current testing. Here's his full scale IQ, which was 83. You've got the dotted line this is what you expect. He's doing more poorly than you expect based off of his academics, which is what we would anticipate seeing with somebody who's has an IEP or so he's doing more poorly there. But when you move into kind of what he knows versus what he can do and how he can apply it independently, he was doing significantly worse. When you look at it in relation to other individuals with ARND or PFA or partial FAS, it's very much the same pattern. This is the type of pattern that I expect to see, where there's this disconnection and downward slope from higher structure, higher knowledge to lower structure and needing to do things more independently.
And in regards to that downward slope, did you see that also in his language testing, memory language testing, as well as visual spatial memory testing?
I did. So on the left side, this is language learning and memory. So when the language test was concrete, highly structured, a list of words, he did well. As the test became more complex, more challenging, having him remember some short stories, not as well, low average. But when I had him trying to remember longer stories and more complicated information in those stories, he had significantly greater problems. So this downward trend from less complex to greater complexity. Same sort of thing with the visual spatial memory. When he had to copy and remember relatively simple figures, geometric figures, did okay. When he had to remember much more complicated figures that weren't necessarily geometrical, considerably greater difficulties, again, as it became more complex.
And is this what you would expect to see in a person with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder?
Yes.
And then how about that downward slope regarding adaptive functioning?
Yeah, so there's a lot of overlap between executive functions and adaptive skills. So being able to generate ideas more independently, being able to understand concepts and things like that. But when you're in kind of the more direct measures, more structured and setting of a test of his skills, he does slightly better than if you're just looking at his ability to do things. If somebody is reporting on his ability to do things on a day-to-day basis. Similarly, we're seeing kind of as his ability to apply some of those things as far as language goes and adaptive skills and kind of daily living adaptive skills. We're seeing this downward trend between the higher structure of direct testing and the lack of structure when it's kind of in the real world, trying to apply those.
Okay. Now, another thing that is tested, if you could just discuss with us briefly, is suggestibility and why that's tested.
Yeah, like I said, we do measure suggestibility. Individuals with FASD do tend to be suggestible. And so we want to assess that as much as possible. And so we do that in kind of, it's kind of like they call it interrogative. It's kind of like an interrogation style where you ask a bunch of questions, say a person does something wrong, it was incorrect, and then they have to ask the questions again and see if they change their answers. And people with FASD are pretty highly prone to that. So we do assess it.
And what did, hang on just a second. How did he score on suggestibility?
Okay. So the first two parts of it. So this is Mr. Cruz's raw score. So the absolute score that he got on each of these items. This first group here is from the test manual, comparing against other individuals, other adults. This is also from the test manual, comparing against individuals that had been diagnosed with intellectual disabilities. This was a small group of individuals with FASD who had been involved in forensic criminal cases, a published study. And then this was a published study of individuals with FASD who were just in the clinically. They weren't involved in any litigation or criminal cases. And what we see is that compared to the normal individuals, and we saw that on the graph, compared to kind of the normative group, Mr. Cruz is doing significantly worse with respect to immediate recall, immediately remembering a story, and delayed recall of that story, but fairly consistent with his performances for individuals with intellectual disabilities, the forensic population of FASD, and the clinical population of FASD. Relatively consistent there. When it comes to endorsing the questions that weren't in the story, the first time through, again, not significantly worse than it was trending towards poorer performance. Higher scores bad here. Tending towards poorer performance against compared to the adult general population, but relatively consistent with the other groups. When it comes to going through that same set of questions a second time, and does he endorse more, which he did, that was significantly worse than the adult general population, but relatively consistent with intellectual disabilities or FASD. When it came to the actual shift, how many times did he really change his answers? Again, worse than general population. He actually did a little bit better than the FASD criminal population. Did a little bit better on that. And so overall suggestibility, again, significantly worse than the normal population, but relatively consistent with those with intellectual disabilities and the clinical population of people with FASD.
All right. Now there was a graph that I think was produced by one of the state doctors comparing Nick to individuals in the juvenile justice system. And did you review that?
I did.
And can you show us the graph that you made of that information?
Yes. Let's see. Yes. So the purple dots, this was a study from Canada of juveniles in the justice system. These were age 12 to 18-year-olds. So mean age was about 15, a little bit younger than Mr. Cruz at the time of our testing. They were also diagnosed using the Canadian FAS guidelines. The Canadian guidelines are more restrictive than the guidelines that I use. Instead of that, identifying the deficit at one standard deviation below the mean like I do based off of the CDC, they use a cutoff of 2 standard deviations below the mean. So a person has to be moderately impaired in order for them to identify as an impairment at all. So it was a little bit more restrictive group. So as you might expect, Mr. Cruz was doing a little bit better. But this green swath that you see here, that is the standard deviation range that was reported in the study of the juveniles, the youth with relating to FASD. And so in nearly all, so there's 20 scores that are represented here. In 13 of them, 13 of them, Mr. Cruz's performance was within the range of 1 standard deviation, either above or below the mean. So for the most part, fairly consistent. There's a couple places where he's significantly better. This was in that list learning task. He did better on that than that group. And then he did worse on this motor coordination task of the finger tapping, being able to tap his fingers quickly, so motor speed. He had difficulties. But for most of the other scores, it was within that range. So pretty consistent, even though these individuals were being diagnosed with a much more restrictive system.
Okay. Now, if you would, I'd like you to summarize your findings of Nick's testing and his your examination of his testing across his lifespan.
Right. So based on the current testing, as I said before, Mr. Cruz is demonstrating deficits in 9 different domains of functioning. Splits across domains of intellectual functioning. We talked about that. Academic impairments, all 3 aspects that were assessed or that were part of the assessment here. And so as far as the splits across domains, these were found early on at age 5. Academic impairments, like I'd said, found throughout his schooling on standardized testing. Impairments in learning and memory of complex language and visual spatial information. Memory impairments were found on testing when he was 5 years old. Visual spatial construction, poor organization, again, on testing that was done when he was 5, he also demonstrated impairments there. Fine motor speed, his mother had indicated that at 3.5 years old, but there was no testing that was indicating it directly when he was younger. The executive functioning. So he was demonstrating impairments in idea generation, inhibition, able to quickly shift the focus of attention, working memory, initial problem solving, those perseverations, doing things over and over again, even if they're not helping you, and the suggestibility. There were impairments in executive functioning found when he was 5 years old. Expressive and receptive communication, both on direct testing that was done currently and on informant report when he was 3.5 years old, and also on testing that was done both at 3.5 and 5 years old. Daily living skills was found on current testing, as well as found at age 3.5 based off of his adoptive mother's report. And the socialization functioning, primarily reported both by the mother when he was 3.5 and also noted in the school records or in the evaluation when he was 5. So he's demonstrating deficits in 9 out of the 11 domains that were assessed currently.
Okay, and then at the bottom there regarding the significant functional disabilities?
Yeah, so we're seeing that, yes, there are a lot of deficits across a lot of domains, but you can have deficits, but not in several domains, but not that widespread as far as how many scores were impaired, or looking at kind of what the severity levels are. So overall, from that graph that we looked at earlier, 53% of Mr. Cruz's current test scores were within the impaired range. 53%, more than half of those scores were in the impaired range. Of those, 40% were in either the mildly or mildly to moderately impaired range. So the large majority were in that range. But still, 7.5% were in the moderately to severely impaired range, and 6% were within the severely impaired range. So not only are we seeing a lot of scores that are impaired, typically with a normal individual, we actually do anticipate seeing impairments on neuropsychological testing, but usually that's 15%, maybe as high as 20%. Here we're seeing 53%, far in excess of what you'd expect to see if he was a normal individual. And we're seeing mostly mild or mild to moderate, but still areas of quite significant, much more significant impairment. And regardless of what that level, it has an impact on his functioning.
Now, you mentioned on that graph that had that you added the green swath to show the range of standard deviations from the norm. And I think you said that was from a study that was based in Canada. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you said that the diagnostic or criteria in Canada is more strict. And just tell me briefly what you mean by that.
Yeah, so like I said, on the CDC's guidelines that I use for my evaluations requires deficits of at least 1 standard deviation below the mean. So 16th percentile. The Canadian guidelines also are looking for deficits in at least 3 domains, but they have to be 2 standard deviations below the mean. So basically at about a 2nd percentile. So that's the Canadian guidelines that they use.
Are there guidelines that use a standard deviation other than 1 as the CDC uses and other than 2 as they use in Canada?
Yeah, there's another another group, Hoyme was the lead author on it. In 2015, they published their attempts to more operationalize the IOM's guidelines. And they set the cut point at 1.5 standard deviation below the mean. So basically, they're looking for it's got to be mildly to moderately impaired range, and not including those that were more mildly impaired.
And I know the CDC requires, I think you said, impairments in 3 domains. Is that correct?
Right.
And do some of these other criteria use a different number in terms of the number of domains that need to be impaired?
Slightly. I mean, and Hoyme talks about the Hoyme ones that are the minus 1.5 do talk about 4 domains, but they're spread out. So it's IQ, there's neuropsych, there's behavior, and there's developmental. So it's looking at those areas in slightly different ways than the CDC does, but it's still looking at kind of behavior over looking at those impairments in behavior.
So if you apply the different standards as identified by the CDC or by Canada or by the IOM, if you apply different standards to Nick's neuropsychological testing, does it change your opinion about what his neuropsychological testing is indicative of?
No. If you use the Canadian guidelines, he would still have deficits in 7 domains.
And is the Canadian one the most stringent of the ones that you're aware of?
Yes.
Okay. And that opinion that you have based on his testing and your record review, if you would just summarize your ultimate opinion for us.
That Mr. Cruz's pattern of functioning is consistent with the diagnosis of neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure, as in DSM-5. It's also consistent with the IOM and CDC guidelines for pattern of neuropsychological impairments for individuals with FASD. And it is consistent with the medical diagnosis of alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, or ARND, that was made by Dr. Jones, who you'll hear from later.
Okay. John, if I may have just a moment.
Sure.
Just one last thing. Dr. Connor, if you can hear me.
Yes, sorry.
That's all right. Going back to the actual administration of this neuropsychological testing that you did of Nick, the actual process of being at the jail and doing it, is there a reason why it's not recorded in some way, meaning audio recorded?
Yes.
And what's that?
Well, there's been ample research that use of third-party observation, so somebody else sitting in and observing testing be administered, whether that be a human being sitting in the room or some sort of recording device, whether it be audio or video, has an impact on test-taking behavior. It changes how the person responds. So very much the recommendation, the admonition from all neuropsychological societies is that you don't allow third-party observers. The other aspect of it is that if a person is sitting in, they are now being shown test material that is copyrighted and needs to be kept secure. And if a test is no longer secure, and let's say the questions are released in some way, then that test would likely lose its validity, and later down the road, we wouldn't be able to use that test. So we have ethical and legal requirements that we not allow the test that we protect the security of those tests. So for both of those reasons, we don't allow, and I do not allow, a third-party observer, or whether it be a human or video or audio recorded while I'm doing testing.
All right. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your time very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to take a 15-minute recess. Please do not discuss the case. Please leave your notepads behind. Okay, the jurors have been excused. We're going to be in recess. It's 3. Everyone else may be seated and state when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning. Good afternoon, Dr. Connor. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good.
How about yourself?
Good. So let me start off. Are you board certified in neuropsychology?
I am not.
How do you become board certified in neuropsychology?
It's a voluntary process, not required in order to practice as a neuropsychologist, but it requires a period of study, to take a written exam, then to provide various work samples that are reviewed, and then eventually participate in an oral examination.
And you have not done that?
That's correct.
Okay. Are you board certified in forensic psychology?
No, I'm not.
Do you have any formal training in forensic psychology?
No.
Are you board certified in any discipline?
No.
Do you recognize the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And do you recognize that as an authoritative source?
It's one of the several neuropsychological societies in the United States. It's a very good one.
Okay. And do you have the American Academy of Clinical Psychology listed on your CV?
No, I have the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology.
I'm sorry, neuropsychology.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
I thought that's what I was speaking about.
Okay.
Okay. And you're a member?
I am.
Okay. Are you a full member or an affiliate?
I'm an affiliate member.
Okay. Is it against the bylaws to put in writing or orally that you're a member of the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology?
That I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Well, if you get a chance, I suggest you check. I think it says that you have to be, to say you're a member of the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology, or to print it. And I may be wrong, but it indicates you can't do that unless you're a full member.
Your Honor, just object to testifying by counsel, please.
Overruled.
Okay? Okay. Are you licensed to practice psychology in the state of Florida?
I'm not.
How many criminal cases have you been involved in where Dr. Richard Adler has been involved?
I do not know the exact number.
Hold on just a second, please. What is the objection?
Relevance, please.
Do you want to argue this?
Can you speak to the lawyer's sidebar, please?
Okay, Dr. Connor, you can answer. You want me to repeat the question?
Please do.
Sure. How many criminal cases have you been involved in when Dr. Richard Adler was also involved in the same case?
I do not know the exact answer to that.
Okay.
It has been a number of cases.
Okay. If I said approximately 150 cases, the government in your career?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead. You were going to answer. I don't want to interrupt you.
I've testified in one of those cases. I've had a couple of cases.
Okay. So once. Okay. So how many cases, let me put it this way. What percentage of your income is derived from you being hired by defense attorneys in criminal cases?
I don't know the specific percentage of my income. I know the percentage of my work that is criminal versus clinical.
So you have no idea what percentage of your income is derived by being hired by criminal defense attorneys in criminal cases?
I don't track that number in my software.
And you have no idea?
I do make more from criminal cases, for sure. And about 60% of my work is clinical.
So do you have no idea how you would answer my question? How much of your income is derived by being hired by criminal defense attorneys in criminal cases?
I derive more income from criminal cases than I do from clinical cases, yes. I don't know the exact number.
And you don't know what the money number is? Is that what you're saying?
No.
Okay. When were you hired in this case?
I'm sorry?
When were you hired in this case?
I was contacted in December of 2020, and the contract was finalized in March of 2021.
Okay. And when?
March.
Of 2020?
2021.
2021. Okay. And then you met with the defendant on May 20th, 2021?
Correct.
Okay. And you met with him for 5 hours?
Yes.
And where was that?
That was at Broward County Jail. I don't know the specific name of it, sorry.
Okay. That's fine. And it was all in one day?
Yes.
And you did some interviewing?
That's correct.
What percentage of the 5 hours did you do interviewing?
That's usually about 1 hour.
Okay. Did you videotape that 1 hour?
No, I did not.
Did you audio tape that 1 hour?
I did not.
Because that wouldn't be interfering with any of your testing, would it?
No, but it is also not part of my practice to video or audio tape any of my evaluation.
Okay. Did you know in the state of Florida that defense counsel has a right to be present during any testing or any interview of one of their clients?
I was made aware of that.
Okay. And are you aware when a state expert examines a defendant in a criminal case, not only does defense counsel have a right to be there, but it has to be videotaped? Did you know that, Dr. Connor?
I don't recall that.
Your Honor, may we have a sidebar, please?
Sure.
Just so the objection is clear for the record, what the defense is objecting to was Mr. Satz's statement that the law in the state of Florida requires that expert evaluations be videotaped. the law in the state of Florida does not require that. It happened in this case by agreement of the parties, as the court has just noted on the record. The order that you signed, I believe it was February 28, 2022. The reason why the defense proceeded to ask Dr. Connor about his procedures and methodology that he implements as to whether or not he videotapes expert evaluations of criminal defendants, that is not his practice. And like what I already just said, is throughout the depositions of our experts, the state has made inferences that our experts were doing something wrong because they didn't videotape. So by the state asking Dr. Connor if he's aware of a law in the state of Florida that requires the videotaping of expert evaluations of criminal defendants, which it does not, that in fact is misleading the jury into thinking that Dr. Connor did something improper by not doing it.
Okay.
Does that make sense, Judge?
It does.
Okay.
But I think that the state can just rephrase their question, and then if both sides agree to just stay away from this area, because this is going to be confusing.
I'm fine with that.
The witness is going to have to concede that although that's his practice, that under certain circumstances it's appropriate. For example, when a court orders it.
We wouldn't have agreed to it if the law wasn't, I remember the law was provided, and that's why because our experts don't want to do it either. Why would we do that?
Mr. Sachs, I don't remember. When you all agree to something, but I don't do the legwork and the research, I leave that up to you. So maybe the best practice would be to excuse the jury for the evening. It's 4:30. You all can look into this. We can reconvene 30 minutes before the jurors come back tomorrow, and you all can show me what you agreed to.
Okay.
But I seem to have a recollection, Judge, that because you were only allowing 2 experts in for the state to evaluate the defendant, you wanted to videotape so that you could show it to your other experts.
No, that was an advantage of it, but that's not why we agreed to it. We almost lost an expert because he said it, you know.
I need to refresh my memory, quite frankly, and I can't do it right now because I really don't remember this.
We'll accept your suggestion that we recess and we research it.
Okay. Like I said, I sign off on it when both sides agree. I'm not as involved in the research, so.
There's been a lot of pleadings, and I have to review them too.
Okay, so I will have, how about if we reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock and I'll have the jurors here at 9:30? Do you think that will give us enough time?
Perfect.
Or is there any way we can just skip this particular issue and have him continue his testimony until 5 and then you think he'll be going over till tomorrow, Mr. Sachs, and then we can deal with that issue since we already have the witness here?
I'd rather deal with it now so we get a flow of the.
It feels like it's been a long day for a Monday. I know we didn't start till 10:40, but we all started earlier.
Yeah, we just had 2 other experts that we flew in for tomorrow, but
Well, since this person is on, I don't know what else to do. It's 4:30. I need to review this issue. Go back and look through my notes. I'm not able to do it on the spot. I'm trying to, but I'm not finding anything, and I want to be able to be informed. So do you want to start earlier? We can start at 8:30 and have the jury here at 9, if that helps with your witness availability.
is he there? Oh, he's in Washington State, so that's 5:30 in the morning for Dr. Connor.
Oops. There's a 3-hour time difference?
Apparently.
So he was gonna start this morning at 6?
Yes. 6:30.
Okay, so what was your suggestion?
I would like to continue through the rest of the day, but if the court doesn't want to, we'll just start at the same time tomorrow.
Okay, but I don't want to have the jurors waiting, so how long will it take to hash out this issue, and what time are we meeting before the witness continues?
Well, it's like you said, Your Honor, it's 4:30. Why don't we just start tomorrow?
That's what I'm saying. I'm just
Okay.
trying to figure out the time. Okay, I'm just gonna make a decision. Tomorrow, I'll have the lawyers back at 9. I'll tell the jurors to be back at 9:30.
Okay, great.
And your witness 9:30, please. Hopefully he's a morning person. Sorry about that. I mean, it's,
No, it's not your fault.
okay, so I'm gonna have the bailiffs excuse the jurors for the evening, tell them to be back at 9:30, and we're in recess. Dr. Connor, we are in recess, please, Dr. Connor, this is Judge Scher, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear you.
We're gonna recess until tomorrow. I just want to let you know that the rule of sequestration has been invoked, so please don't discuss your testimony between today and tomorrow. He's an expert witness. But you're not gonna be consulting him regarding another expert testimony between today and tomorrow.
The only thing that I would communicate with him would be about his availability in the morning and what time.
Okay, well, that doesn't count. That's scheduling. Okay. All right, thank you. The attorney,
So I'm dismissed for the day?
yes, sir. The attorney, Mr. Secor, will be in touch about what time we need you back tomorrow, okay?
All right.
Why don't we do
That's
while the witnesses
problem.
online? You can tell us what you want to be available. Approach the podium.
But he wants to, okay, what time? Sure, approach the podium. This seems like overly difficult task.
Hey, Don, can you hear
I'm
me?
making it overly
I can hear you.
We have an issue that we need to resolve pertaining to your cross-examination, and we were going to try to get it done today, but can you testify tomorrow morning?
I have an in-custody evaluation scheduled all day tomorrow.
Okay, so here's the thing, sir. You have an in-custody evaluation at 6 o'clock in the morning?
I have to be up to the facility by 7:30,
You're gonna have to push
and
it
it's an
back.
hour drive from where I live.
Sir, I'm sorry, things happen. You're gonna have to push it back. I need you here. You're under subpoena. I'm not excusing you. Please make yourself available at 9:30 so the state can cross-examine you.